Recording. Okay, I'll stop at the edge of the slide. Alright, give me a clap. And give us like 5 seconds of silence and then come in.
Good morning, Gateway. Welcome to Church Online. We're so glad that you could join us this morning. It's great to be with you. We hope you've had a great week, and for those of us who are in the Waikato, we hope you enjoy being back at level 2. A few announcements from me this morning. We mentioned last Sunday that we've made the decision to remain online with no in-person gatherings at 950 Victoria Street until at least the COVID-19 protection framework has come into effect. It's at this point we believe we will have a clear pathway to determine how and when we can gather together here at Gateway in the safest way possible. So even though the Waikato has moved to level 2, we will remain online until this time. Also, in October, we announced that as part of our annual Christmas appeal, we were contributing to the Hamilton Christian Combined Food Bank. The food bank contacted us this week to let us know that due to the uncertainty of alert levels at this time and throughout December, they are no longer accepting food bags. Rather, they would ask those who would like to contribute that they make a financial donation instead. Gateway will be accepting donations on their behalf, and you can do this in 2 ways. Make an electronic payment to Gateway's bank account using Food Bank as a reference. Details of our bank account can be found on our website under the Give tab, or you can come into reception and pay via EFTPOS. If you had already begun to collect items for Food Bag, we are collecting donations for the Salvation Army, and there's a list available from the office for the most needed items. You can drop all donations to the office during our office hours, Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. The last day for collection will be Tuesday the 14th of December. If you have any questions on this, please email office@gatewaychurch.org.nz. Finally, we wanted to take this opportunity to share with you some of the ways we as a community have been able to be generous during this season. Over the past few months, we've given $5,000 to Hamilton Combined Food Bank, $5,000 to the Women's Refuge, and we've continued to support the ministry of Canon Andrew White. We've also been able to hand out food parcels and phone cards and help pay medical bills for people within our community. And we remain extremely grateful to everyone who faithfully gives financially to the various ministry aspects in the life of Gateway. Without your ongoing acts of worship, we simply couldn't do the things we do. So that's it from me for now. Let's worship.
Kia ora whānau, welcome to church. Let's worship together.
Where will you run, my soul? Where will you go when wells run dry? When the wind starts to blow, how you gonna keep this flame alive? In the fading light when night is breaking, I know you will always be waiting. You'll always be there. I'm running to the secret place where you are, where you are. I'll sing to you of all the ways you stole my heart, stole my heart. Better is a moment that I spend with you than a million other days away. I'm running, I'm running, I'm running to the secret place. You are my only hope. You are the rock on which I stand. You will not let me go. I know that I'm safe inside your hands. In the fading light when night is breaking, I know you will always be waiting. You'll always be there. I'm running to the secret place where you are, where you are. I'll sing to you of all the ways
satisfied here with you, here with you. Chains will hit the floor, broken lives restored. We couldn't ask for more. Here with you, here with you.
Hands are lifted high, hearts can wait to light. We are satisfied here with you, here with you. Chains will hit the floor, broken lives restored. We couldn't ask for more. Here with you, here with you. Running to the secret place where you are, where you are. I'll sing to you of all the ways you stole my heart, stole my heart. But there is a moment that I spent with you, that I'm living all the days away. I'm running, I'm running, I'm running to the secret place. I am the Lord your God. I go before you now. I stand beside you, and I'm all around you. Though you feel I'm far away, I am closer than your breath. I am with you, more than you know. so don't be afraid. Though your heart and flesh may fail you, I'm your faithful strength. I am with you wherever you go. Come to me, I'm all you need. Come to me, I'm everything. Come to me, I'm all you need. Come to me, I'm everything. Oh, how high would I climb mountains if the mountains were where you hide? Oh, how far I'd scale the valleys if you'd grace the other side. And oh, how long have I chased rivers from lowly seas to where they rise, against the rush of grace descending from the source of its supply. 'Cause in the Highlands and the heartache, you're neither more or less inclined. I would search and stop at nothing. You're just not that hard to find. So I will praise you on the mountains. I will praise you when the mountain's in my way. You're the summit where my feet are. So I will praise you in the valleys all the same. No less God within the shadows. No less faithful when the night leads me astray. You're the heaven where my heart is. In the Highlands and the heartache all the same. Oh, oh, oh. Oh, how far beneath your glory does your kindness extend the path, from where your feet rest on the sunrise to where you sweep the sinners past. And oh, how far will you come running if just to shadow me through the night? Trace my steps through all my failures and walk me out the other side. For who could dare ascend that mountain, that valiant hill called Calvary? For the one I call Good Shepherd, who like a lamb was slain for me. Oh, I will praise you on the mountains. I will praise you when the mountain's in my way. You're the summit where my feet are. So I will praise you in the valleys all the same. No less God within the shadows. praise you when the mountain's in my way. You're the summit where my feet are. So I will praise you in the valleys, oh sing. No less God within the shadows, no less faithful when the night leads me astray. You're the heaven where my heart is. In the Highlands, in the heart echo sing.
Good morning, Gateway. Lovely to be with you again in this incredibly beautiful setting. Astonishing to think that the season of Advent is on us once again. This year has been so disrupted by COVID lockdowns that the days seem to have run together into an eternal Groundhog Day. And suddenly, a month or so ago, we realised that the Advent season was coming upon us quickly. So we sat down, as we normally do, and discussed what the theme for this year's teaching would be. You know, when you've been pastoring for 40 odd years, it seems like there isn't much that you haven't said on the topic of Christmas. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the Christmas season, but finding a new teaching theme each year does provide its own challenges. Actually, I suspect it's not much different from you who are listening to the Christmas sermons. There's probably not much that you haven't heard before either. Novelty, of course, is not the goal, and I doubt that with all of our sermons we will ever plumb the magnificent depths of the incarnation, of God becoming flesh and entering our world to restore and to redeem. As we sat down a month or so ago, I'm not sure that John Lennon's song Imagine was actually part of the conversation, but I definitely thought of it afterwards as we began to imagine that meeting, what the world would look like if Christ had never come at Christmas. Now, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Lennon's songs. The words go, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It's not hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Now, what John Lennon did, of course, is put into words and thoughts and lyrics many of our generation's more vocal atheists' thoughts. Lennon suggested that the world would be better off without religion, better off without Christianity, and better off without Christmas. And of course, over the last 2 decades, men like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Victor Stenger, Christopher Hitchens have all published best-selling books disparaging religion in general and Christianity in particular, claiming rather stridently that the world would be a better place if they had never existed. Other writers like E.O. Wilson, Carl Sagan, Daniel Dennett and Steven Pinker have added their verbal and literary skills to say essentially the same things. These Grinch-like characters and others like them would gladly rid the world of Christmas and every trace of what it means. But what would the world be like if they were successful? And it's that very question that we want to explore over this Advent season. Imagine, as John Lennon says, imagine a world without Christmas, without the incarnation. What if Jesus had never come? What would our world look like without Christmas? In exploring this theme over the next few weeks, we want, if it were even possible, to put aside what Jesus did in his redemptive capacity as the Son of God, as the Word made flesh. So in this series, we aren't going to examine the redemptive aspects, the theological aspects of Christ's coming. Now, obviously, what Christ accomplished redemptively in his life, death, and resurrection is the preeminent accomplishment of Christmas. And to not talk about those things is to move from the center of the picture to the very margins. Instead of focusing in this series on the rock landing in the pond, what we're going to do is look at the farthest ripples as they touch the outskirts of the pond. What would it be like in our society if Christ had never come, without Christmas? The reality is, without Christmas, much of the world that you and I take for granted would look vastly different than it does now. You and I think in concepts and terms that have been dramatically shaped by Christmas. So much so that for the most part it's absolutely oblivious to us. Tom Holland, in his magisterial work Dominion, the Making of the Western Mind, says, "To live in a Western country is to live in a society utterly saturated by Christian concepts and assumptions. The West, increasingly empty though the pews may be, remains firmly moored to its Christian past." So the purpose of this teaching in the Advent season is to draw your attention to some of the many ways in which Christmas has dramatically shaped our world. Yale scholar and historian Jaroslav Pelikan once stated, "Jesus has dominated the history of the world for 20 centuries. If it were possible with some kind of super magnet to pull out of that history every scrap of metal bearing at least a trace of his name, how much would be left?" And the short answer to that question is not much. Without Christmas, we simply wouldn't have Western civilization as we presently know it. Jesus and the movement that he started are at the very root, the very foundation of Western civilization. And the desire of many Western intellectuals and elites to repudiate their Christian roots is an act of historical denial, of historical amnesia and revisionism. The person that Christmas introduced us to has dramatically shaped history. He has had an awe-inspiring impact on the world. H.G. Wells says, "I am a historian and not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very centre of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all of history." Now that's a staggering thing to say, since it would actually be hard to choose a figure less likely to change history than Jesus from a human point of view. I mean, he was a poor carpenter, born in an obscure village in an oppressed nation. Never wrote a book, never held political office, never travelled any more than 300 kilometres from his birthplace. And those who became his followers were probably even less likely to be considered world changers. And yet today it is impossible to imagine the world without his imprint. Put simply, Christmas changed everything. Let me explore with you in the time that we have this morning a concept that I think perhaps many of you have never considered, but that was dramatically shaped by the Judeo-Christian world with Christmas at its heart. And I'm talking about the concept of time. Now, actually, like most aspects of our worldview, we don't actually give space to thinking about these things. We simply assume them. But if we were to stop and consider the concept of time, we would realise that for us Westerners, time runs in a linear sequence. Time might be compared perhaps to an arrow or to a river. It has a source, it has a course, and it has a goal. And for most of Western history, at least before the Enlightenment, people understood that God was the source, the guide, and the goal of that linear sequence of history. History was his story, and as such it was regarded as sacred and divinely guided. Now, it might come as somewhat of a surprise to you to know that that is not the way the ancients thought about time, and it's actually not the way that some cultures and religions think about time even today. For numerous people in various ages, time has been understood to run in secular terms. It wasn't, and in some cultures still isn't, considered to be linear, as we imagine it to be, with a source, a guide, and a goal. For them, it's conceived to be a series of eternal recurrences, endlessly repeating patterns that belong to the immutable structure of the universe. So the seasons, summer, autumn, winter, and spring, repeating endlessly. The life cycle of birth, growth, decline, and death, followed by the next generation that repeats it endlessly. All in a reiterated sequence in which nothing fundamentally changed. An endless cycle of succession, each cycle repeating exactly the events, acts, and personages of the preceding cycle. That secular view of time is sometimes called cosmological or mythical time. And as I say, it consists of endless cycles around a wheel. Some of you old rockers might remember an album and a song title from Crosby, Stills and Nash called Deja Vu. And the lyrics of that particular song go, if I had ever been here before on another time around the wheel, I would probably know just how to deal with all of you. And I feel like I've been here before. We have all been here before. We have all been here before. It's a commentary on that secular view of going round and round the mythical wheel of time. And most Eastern faiths have that secular approach of time built into their worldview. The writer to Ecclesiastes, whoever he was, some have suggested the author might have been Eeyore, Pooh Bear's ever glum and pessimistic friend, was struggling with life's meaning. It all seemed incredibly pointless to him, just this endless cycle of vanity going round and round. And in chapter 1, verse 4 through 11, it says, generations come and generations go, but the world stays just the same. The sun still rises and still goes down, going wearily back to where it must start all over again. The wind blows south, the wind blows north, round and back again. Every river flows into the sea, but the sea is not yet full. The water returns to where the rivers began and start all over again. Everything leads to weariness, a weariness too great for words. What has happened before will happen again. What has been done before will be done again. There's nothing new in the whole world. Look, they say, here's something new, but no, it's all happened before, long before we were born. He's talking about that wheel of time. And that conception of time inevitably produces a deeply conservative philosophy of life. It justifies the status quo, whatever it happens to be. The inequalities are accepted as written into the structure of the universe, and all attempts to change society are destined to failure. People are what they are, the world is what it is, and is what it will always be, as Doris Day said, que sera, sera. Now, at best, such a conception of time leads to resignation. At worst, it leads to despair and hopelessness. The Judeo-Christian understanding of time, with Christmas at its very heart, is utterly revolutionary. It views time as real, as objective and as linear in nature. And time is seen as a non-repeating linear sequence of events, a journey in which each stage is not exactly like the one before or the one that will be. With that revolutionary concept of time, history, as opposed to mythical or cosmological time, history was born. St. Augustine wrote that those who lacked a Christian understanding of time were doomed to wander in a circuitous maze, finding neither exit nor entry. He said, the course of time, as sure and direct as the flight of an arrow, proceeds in a straight line from Genesis to Revelation, from creation to the day of judgment. Christianity understands that history is a cosmic story, and like all stories, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. It has a plot. Secular history doesn't. The circle is the symbol of endlessness. No beginning, no middle, no end. The key elements of this cosmic history laid out in our scriptures are, the chapter headings, if you like, are outlined as creation, fall, election, redemption, and consummation. History is purposefully directional. Missionary statesman Leslie Newbigin states of the Bible, it is a universal cosmic history. It interprets the entire story of all things from creation to consummation, and the story of the human race within creation, and at the very center, the story of the one in whom God's purpose was decisively revealed. The Christian faith is a particular way of understanding history as a whole, which finds in the story about Jesus its decisive clue. Paul was talking about Christmas in a sense when he said, in the fullness of time, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. If I could paraphrase that, I would say, at the proper time in this unfolding linear sequence of history, God sent his son. So in the West, our notion of time is profoundly Christian. Now you might be thinking, well, Don, that's mildly interesting, but so what? Well, let me explain the so what to you briefly. This concept of linear time is inextricably wedded to two other ideas, that of progress and that of hope. If time is not inherently endlessly cyclical, then time can become the arena of change, of progress, and of hope rather than simply resignation and despair. Progress and hope are linked to that linear understanding of time and are profoundly Christian notions. They are the offspring of Christian faith, of Christmas, if you like. I remember a few years ago we had Australian biblical scholar Ricky Watts in our midst, and I remember Ricky taking out of his pocket his mobile phone, and he held it up and boldly proclaimed, "The reason you have a mobile phone is because of the Christian view of history and time." And he was talking about progress and development and change as being inextricably wedded to the Christian understanding of time. Robert Nisbet authored a book entitled The History of the Idea of Progress, and he would agree with Ricky Watts. He wrote, "The history of the idea of progress is an idea closely linked with and dependent on religion," by which he meant Christianity, "and upon the intellectual constructs derived from it." He went on to say, ancients had no concept of progress. They didn't so much reject the idea, they just didn't even entertain it. And Nisbet isn't alone in his assertion. Rodney Stark, professor of sociology and comparative religion at the University of Washington, said, "The assumption of progress may be the most critical difference between Christianity and all other religions." And John McMurray in his book, The Clue to History, said, "That we think of progress at all shows the extent of the influence of Christianity upon us." Now the funny thing is, the thing that we don't obviously see is noted by scholars who are looking from the outside. A number of Chinese scholars over the years have been studying Western society and Western civilization, asking the question, why has it been so successful? And one of them wrote this. He said, "We were tasked with looking into what accounted for the preeminence of the West over the rest of the world. We studied everything we could from historical, political, economic and cultural perspectives. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we did. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic systems. But over the last 20 years, we have realized at the very heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West has been so powerful." Sometimes it takes an outsider to see what we are blinded to. Now, I don't mean to sound as if I'm trumpeting the glories of the West, for its history is clearly not an unblotted copybook. As I look at the West from a darker point of view, I don't think it takes much actually in the way of prophetic giftings to see that we possibly are living at a time when we are watching at the very least the decline, if not the complete dissolution of the West's preeminence. And I, for one, would want to say I don't think it's coincidental that this cultural decline and possible demise has followed on the heels of a large-scale rejection of our Christian heritage and its grand story by our cultural intellectuals and elites. They have deliberately unhitched the idea of progress from its Christian roots and have determined that we can have it without the Christian constraints and influence. We can have progress on our own terms. Like Adam and Eve, we can be our own gods, determining for ourselves what is good and evil. And I suspect we have been and we will continue to be no more successful in that task than Adam and Eve were. The West has become a cut flower culture. Cut from its roots, the initial bloom of our civilization is actually failing and fading fast, and we are living on the remains of yesterday's life. Yep, for sure, we're still experiencing technological progress and progress in other dimensions, but overall, our culture is becoming more and more disillusioned and cynical about where this supposed culture is taking us, and of which elites and of what ideologies are driving it. The hope that was wedded to the progress that God's story brought to us has largely taken wings and left our culture. And increasingly, people are commenting on the climate of hopelessness that now characterizes our civilization. We are experiencing the weariness, the emptiness, the vanity that the writer of Ecclesiastes warned us of when we embraced a life that's lived under the sun without reference to the greater, higher heavenly story. Of course, we still have our cultural optimists, Steven Pinker being foremost among them. Steven Pinker is a Harvard College professor and has written a number of best-selling books Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress, and another book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he boldly proclaims that we are on a steady path towards massive improvement in almost every field that you care to examine. So rejoice, people, be optimistic. Mankind is on an upward curve of progress. However, I would want to say that optimism is never a solid enough base to build a civilization on. Optimism is based on extrapolation, on cause and effect thinking. We draw conclusions about the future based on our experience of the present and the past. And we say, since this has happened, we conclude that this is likely to occur. If our extrapolation is correct, then of course our optimism is grounded. But if the extrapolation is incorrect, then the optimism is misplaced and illusory. There's a Latin word that encompasses that whole idea of extrapolating thought out in an optimistic way, and it's the Latin word called futurum. You might have heard of the phrase, every day in every way the world is getting better and better, but I would want to say except when it isn't. As an amateur student of history, realistically I don't see much in the way of grounds for the kind of optimism that Pinker and his like are proclaiming. It seems to me, as I look at history, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I'm not hugely optimistic. Perhaps because, among other things, the current global pandemic and the warning of climate catastrophe are dimming my vision. And I'd want to say I'm not optimistic. But I am hopeful. Hope and optimism are two different animals. Biblical hope is very different from optimism, although they are sometimes confused. Both hope and optimism entail a positive expectation with regard to the future, but they are radically different stances toward reality. Hope, in contrast to optimism, is quite independent of present circumstances or of the past. It's not based on possibilities inherent in present circumstances, neither is it just simply a correct extrapolation of present trends into the future. That's futurum. There's another Latin word that describes hope, and it's the word adventus, and it's the word from which we get our English word Advent and the Advent season. The future as adventus is a future that comes not from the realm of what is or what was, but from the realm of what is not yet. It comes from outside, from above. It comes from God. It's a hope grounded in God and in His promises. Optimism, if it's grounded at all, is based on the possibility of things as they have come to be and will continue. Hope is based on possibilities that lie within God, irrespective of how they are right now. In the scripture, the figure that both exhibits faith and hope is Abraham, who hoped against hope because he believed in God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence those things that do not yet exist. Romans chapter 4, verse 17. Biblical hope can thrive in situations like Abraham's, where for extrapolation, cause and effect thinking, the only thing you can elicit is utter hopelessness and despair. Why? Well, because it's based on God coming into death, coming into darkness, coming into our present reality to dispel it with divine life and hope. Every year at this Advent season, we read from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 2. The people who have walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who have lived in the land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. Not much to extrapolate by way of optimism, but into the darkness comes Adventus, comes the hope that comes from God. Advent speaks to us of something radical, something bustling into our world from the outside, something that could never be generated by the conditions of this world. It doesn't emerge as a logical development of the present. We don't simply extrapolate it. It comes as a promise from God, who then fulfills His promises. God's cosmic story is still unfolding. It's going somewhere and not simply round in circles. And I'm part of that story, and so are you. It's not just some great universal story, it's your personal story and my personal story gathered into and unfolded in God's greater story. And so for you and I, time is the arena of change and the place of hope. It's because our story is part of God's story. Now, we all know that sometimes that story can take some dark turns. Perhaps as you're watching this as an individual, you may be presently facing challenging circumstances, loss, grief, sickness, abuse, economic deprivation, family heartache, divorce, most of us profoundly uncertain and times and some anxiety that goes with us. Sometimes it does seem as if life goes around and around. Perhaps like our surrounding culture, you are tempted to give up to cynicism and weary resignation and sing with the Beatles, "Nothing's going to change my world." And when people exhort you to be optimistic, you're tempted to be really rude. Can I give you some advice? Number one, try not to be overly rude. Number two, don't be optimistic. Embrace hope. They are quite different, remember, different foundations. One is sinking sand, the other is solid rock. Adventist time and hope broke into Joseph's world as we saw last week. Joseph had very little in the way of optimism. There was nothing to extrapolate from Joseph's present circumstances to give him optimism for the future. And yet into that situation, God breaks in Adventist time. Because of Christmas, because of the Judeo concept of history and time, we have both the possibility of change and of progress and of hope. Again, some of you might be tempted to say, well, Don, my life does feel like an endless circle of just despair and resignation, and it just seems to be going round and round. In God's purposes and stories, I'd like to finish by saying there is a profound difference between a circle and a spiral. From some points of view, they look exactly alike. But from others, we see clearly that while the circle goes round and round, the spiral does not quite do the same. It lifts and changes. And I'd want to say to you, because of the Christian hope, because of Adventists, even in the midst of things that are going round and round, there is the possibility that it's a spiral and that God can break into it. In this Advent season, can I exhort you to look for God, to wait for God's Adventist time, to reach into those circumstances that you're facing, to allow progress, change, and hope. And I stand hoping with you.
See what you can do, oh God of wonders. Your power has no end. The things you've done before, in greater measure, you will do again. There's no prison wall you can't break through, mountain you can't move, all things are possible. There's no broken body you can't raise, no soul that you can't save, all things are possible. The darkest night, you can light it up, you can light it up. Seated forever on the throne. So why should my heart fear what you've defeated? I will trust in you, Lord. There's no prison wall you can't break through, no mountains you can't move, all things are possible. There's no broken body you can't raise, no soul that you can't save. chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out.
God of revival. God of revival.
Thank you for joining us once again, Gateway. As we normally do, I'm going to invite you wherever you are to lift your hands and allow me the incredible privilege of speaking the blessing of God over you and over your household. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. May the love of God our Father, the incredible grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the intimate friendship and communion of the Holy Spirit be yours today and until he comes. Amen.